December 7th, 1941, 7:48 in the morning. The Hawaiian sun had barely risen above the volcanic ridges of Oahu when the first wave struck. The sound came before understanding a mechanical thunder rolling across the harbor, followed by the shriek of metal tearing through metal. Sailors aboard the USS Arizona looked up from their breakfast trays to see shadows crossing the water, dark shapes that moved with terrible purpose. The smell of burning oil would soon mix with salt air and cordite, a scent that would linger in the nostrils of survivors for decades. In those first moments, as torpedoes found their marks and dive bombers screamed downward through flak and morning light, the men of the Pacific Fleet experienced something between disbelief and recognition, the sudden knowledge that the world they had known an hour before was gone forever. Across the ocean, in Tokyo, champagne bottles were uncorked in staff rooms where maps of the Pacific were pinned to walls. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of the attack, permitted himself no celebration. He knew what his colleagues did not yet fully grasp. "I fear all we have done," he would write in his diary, "is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." But his warning was drowned in the euphoria of junior officers who saw only the immediate result: 8 battleships sunk or damaged, nearly 200 aircraft destroyed, more than 2,000 Americans dead. The Pacific Fleet, Japan's greatest obstacle to empire, lay burning in shallow water. To the strategists of the Imperial Japanese Navy, to the soldiers who would soon sweep through the Philippines and Malaya and the Dutch East Indies, Pearl Harbor represented not just a tactical victory, but a fundamental truth confirmed that the soft, materialistic Americans lacked the will and the warrior spirit to contest Japan's destiny in Asia. They had studied American culture through the lens of their own values and found it wanting. They had read of labor strikes and isolationist movements, of a nation grown comfortable in its wealth and complacent in its distance from the world's conflicts. They had convinced themselves that a democracy built on commerce and individual comfort could not match the steel discipline of a nation unified under imperial purpose, where death in service to the emperor was the highest honor a man could achieve. The Americans, they believed, would count their losses, negotiate a settlement, and withdraw behind their ocean barriers to lick their wounds. The war, if the attack succeeded brilliantly enough, might be over before it truly began, but December 7th was not an ending. It was a threshold, and beyond it lay a transformation that would remake the Pacific and ultimately the world. In the weeks that followed Pearl Harbor, as Japan's forces surged southward like a tide across Southeast Asia, the evidence seemed to support their assessment. The fall of Wake Island came on December 23rd, its small garrison of Marines overwhelmed after a heroic defense. Hong Kong surrendered on Christmas Day. Singapore, the Gibraltar of the East, fell in February 1942 in what Winston Churchill would call the worst disaster and largest capitulation in British history. The Philippines held out longer, but by May, even the fortress of Corregidor had been starved into submission. General Douglas MacArthur, evacuated by presidential order, spoke his famous promise, "I shall return, but to Japanese ears it sounded like empty bravado from a defeated enemy. The Imperial Japanese Army and Navy had conquered an area larger than the continental United States in less than 6 months. They had done so with a speed and efficiency that shocked even their own planners. The soldiers who waded ashore on tropical beaches, who marched into surrendered cities, who raised the rising sun flag over colonial administrations from Burma to the Solomon Islands, these men carried with them the conviction that they were witnessing the birth of a new order, a greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. They had been taught would liberate Asian peoples from white colonialism and establish Japan as the natural leader of the region. That this liberation came at bayonet point, accompanied by atrocities that would scar the memory of entire nations, was a contradiction they had been trained not to see. Lieutenant Tadashi Nakajima, a young officer serving with the Special Naval Landing Forces, wrote home to his family in Hiroshima in March 1942. His letter, preserved in the War Museum there, captures the confidence of that moment. We have swept all before us. The Americans fight clumsily when they fight at all. Their equipment is adequate, but their spirit is weak. They surrender in groups, something no Japanese soldier would contemplate. The war in the Pacific will be concluded by year's end, and I will return to see the cherry blossoms with honor. He underlined the word honor twice. Nakajima would not live to see those blossoms. 2 years later, he would die on a beach in the Marshall Islands, part of a garrison that fought to the last man against an enemy that bore no resemblance to the one he had described in his letter. The Americans they had defeated in those first terrible months were indeed unprepared. The peacetime military had been hollowed by budget cuts and isolationist sentiment. Equipment was often dated, tactics untested against modern warfare. But what the Japanese had not accounted for, what they could not have accounted for, viewing America through the distorted lens of their own cultural assumptions, was the nature of the country they had attacked. They had mistaken decentralization for weakness, debate for indecision, commercial success for softness. They had not understood that a nation built on the principle that ordinary people could govern themselves, that arguments and disagreements were signs of vitality rather than decay, possessed a resilience of a different order than what they knew. In American factories and shipyards, something unprecedented was beginning. Within weeks of Pearl Harbor, automobile plants in Detroit were retooling to produce tanks and aircraft. Shipyards that had launched a handful of vessels per year were being redesigned for mass production on a scale never before attempted. Henry Kaiser, a construction magnate who had never built a ship before the war, would perfect the Liberty ship, a standardized cargo vessel that could be assembled in sections and welded together in an average of 42 days. At the peak of production, Kaiser's Richmond shipyard launched a completed Liberty ship every 24 hours. The numbers were staggering, incomprehensible to military planners trained in the careful husband of limited resources. By 1943, American shipyards were producing more tonnage in a single month than Japan would build in an entire year. The production of aircraft told the same story. In 1941, the United States manufactured fewer than 6,000 military aircraft. In 1944, that number would exceed 96,000. Factories operated in round-the-clock shifts. Women who had never worked outside the home became welders. Riveters, assembly line workers. Rosie the Riveter was not propaganda, but documentary truth. The industrial capacity that Japan had dismissed as mere materialism, as a people's obsession with comfort and consumer goods, revealed itself to be something else entirely. The productive power of a free society mobilized toward common purpose. But raw production numbers, as staggering as they were, tell only part of the story. What changed in those 2 years between December 1941 and late 1943 was not just the quantity of American arms, but the quality of American fighting. The men who had been forced to surrender at Bataan and Corregidor were not cowards. They were soldiers starved of ammunition, food, and hope, abandoned by circumstances beyond their control. The Marines who would storm ashore at Tarawa in November 1943 were forged from different circumstances entirely. The Battle of Midway in June 1942 marked the turning point that military historians cite, the moment when the tide began its slow reversal. American dive bombers arriving over the Japanese carrier fleet at precisely the right moment through a combination of skill, timing, and fortune, destroyed 4 carriers in a single day. Japan's naval aviation, the elite force that had struck Pearl Harbor, was gutted in 5 minutes of combat. But Midway was the strategic turn, not yet the visible transformation. The Japanese still held vast territories. Their army was intact. Their will to fight, tempered in years of conflict in China, remained unbroken. The true turning came in the grinding campaigns that followed Guadalcanal, the Gilberts, the Marshalls. These were battles fought on coral atolls and jungle ridges whose names meant nothing to most Americans before the war. The fighting there was savage, primitive, conducted at close quarters in fetid heat. Japanese soldiers indoctrinated to believe that surrender was the ultimate disgrace, fought with a ferocity that shocked even veteran American Marines. Banzai charges mass infantry assaults that threw men against machine gun positions with no hope of success were tactical madness, but psychological warfare of the highest order. The willingness to die, the complete disregard for individual survival and service to the emperor, was meant to break the enemy's spirit. It did not work. The Americans learned, they adapted, they brought to bear not just industrial might, but tactical innovation. The development of effective combined arms tactics, naval gunfire supporting amphibious assaults, close air support coordinating with ground advances, logistics networks that kept frontline troops supplied across vast distances, represented a military revolution. Japan had expected to face the Americans of 1941, the garrison troops and peacetime sailors who could be defeated in detail. Instead, by 1943, they encountered something they had not imagined, a citizens' army that learned faster than they did. That matched their willingness to fight with superior firepower and a logistics system that seemed almost magical in its abundance. Sergeant Robert Leckie, who would later write a memoir of his service with the 1st Marine Division, described the transformation in a letter home. "We were green at Guadalcanal. Men died because we didn't know what we were doing. But we learned every day, every skirmish we got better. The Japanese fight like demons. I won't deny that. But they fight the same way every time. They don't change. We do. That's going to win this war." The symbolism of that abundance, the material prosperity that Japan had mistaken for weakness, manifested in unexpected ways. Japanese soldiers, isolated on bypassed islands or retreating through jungles, began encountering abandoned American supply dumps. What they found there challenged everything they had been taught about their enemy. Crates of rations stacked carelessly, containing not just rice or hard biscuits, but canned meats, chocolate bars, cigarettes, coffee. Medical supplies in quantities that seemed absurd for the number of wounded. Fresh uniforms, boots, ammunition, in such surplus that it was sometimes destroyed rather than transported. One Japanese officer captured on Saipan in 1944 was shown through an American supply depot. He stood silent for several minutes, then spoke through an interpreter. How can we fight a nation that throws away more than we produce? The chocolate bar, of all things, became an unlikely ambassador of American power. To Japanese soldiers, living on dwindling rice rations supplemented by whatever they could forage, the idea that the enemy distributed candy to its troops as standard issue was almost incomprehensible. It spoke to a depth of resources, a casualness about abundance, that inverted their understanding of the war. They had been told they were fighting soft, decadent men who valued comfort over honor. But what did it mean that these supposedly soft men could storm fortified positions while chewing chocolate, that they could advance through the same jungles and heat while carrying 50 pounds more equipment, that they never seemed to run out of ammunition or food or medicine? By late 1943, the strategic situation had reversed almost completely. The Solomon Islands campaign had ejected Japanese forces from the southern Pacific. The Central Pacific Drive, coordinated by Admiral Chester Nimitz, was island hopping toward Japan itself, bypassing and isolating strong points, seizing atolls for airfields that would bring American bombers closer to the home islands. In the Southwest Pacific, Douglas MacArthur was making good on his promise, advancing up the coast of New Guinea, preparing for the liberation of the Philippines. The Japanese Navy, which had seemed invincible in early 1942, was now husbanding its remaining carriers, unwilling to risk them in major engagements against an American fleet that grew larger and more capable with each passing month. The transformation was visible in the faces of captured Japanese soldiers, those few who allowed themselves to be taken prisoner. They showed not just exhaustion and hunger, though those were present, but a deeper disillusionment. The war they had expected to fight, the quick campaign against a weak-willed enemy, had devolved into an existential struggle against an opponent that seemed to grow stronger the longer the conflict lasted. Some, interrogated by Allied intelligence officers, spoke of the moment they knew the war was lost often, not a single battle, but an accumulation of small realizations. The constant presence of American aircraft overhead, the naval bombardments that preceded every landing, shells falling with mechanical precision for hours or days, the sheer waste of an enemy that could afford to destroy rather than conserve. A letter intercepted from a Japanese sergeant on Bougainville in November 1943 circulated among American intelligence sections. It was addressed to the soldier's brother, still training in Japan. Do not believe what they tell you about the Americans. They are not weak. They are not cowards. They die as hard as we do, but there are always more of them, and they have everything: planes, ships, food, medicine. We have courage, and courage is not enough. I do not know how to explain this to you. Perhaps courage is never enough when the other side has both courage and unlimited resources. Do not come here if you can avoid it. There is no glory here, only mud and death and the sound of their bombers every day. The letter was stamped not to be shared with press, but was shown to senior commanders as evidence of collapsing Japanese morale. Admiral William Halsey, commander of the South Pacific Forces, read it and made a notation in the margin. There, learning what we always knew: freedom is strength, not weakness. The symbolism of that statement went deeper than Halsey perhaps intended. The Americans fighting in the Pacific were not automatons conditioned to follow orders without question. They were civilians in uniform, men drafted from farms and cities, from factories and college classrooms. They complained constantly, griped about food and officers and the heat and the boredom between battles. This grumbling, which would have been unthinkable in the Japanese military culture, was itself a kind of freedom, the right to question, to express discontent, to maintain individual identity, even within military hierarchy. And yet when combat came, these complaining, individualistic men fought with a ferocity and effectiveness that matched and ultimately exceeded their enemies. The doctrine of individual initiative, of empowering sergeants and junior officers to make decisions in fluid combat situations, gave American forces a flexibility that the more rigid Japanese command structure could not match. When communications broke down, when plans fell apart under the chaos of combat, as they always did, American units improvised and adapted. Japanese units, trained to follow orders precisely and lacking explicit instructions for changing circumstances, often froze or repeated failed tactics. This difference in military culture reflected deeper differences in society. An army raised in a democracy where citizens were expected to think for themselves and participate in governance fought differently than an army raised in authoritarian tradition. By November 1943, exactly 2 years after Pearl Harbor, the reality of the Pacific War had inverted completely from Japanese expectations. The Tarawa Atoll in the Gilbert Islands became the symbol of this transformation. The battle there, fought over 4 days of unspeakable carnage, was in many ways a microcosm of the larger conflict. The Japanese garrison of 4,800 men fought almost to the last, fewer than 20 allowing themselves to be captured. They inflicted heavy casualties on the attacking Marines, more than 1,000 American dead, twice that number wounded. But the outcome was never in doubt. The Americans took the island through sheer weight of firepower and willingness to absorb casualties in pursuit of strategic objectives. To the Japanese command, watching from truck in Tokyo, Tarawa should have been a victory. The Americans had bled heavily for a tiny atoll. Surely such losses would shake American resolve, would bring political pressure to negotiate. What they failed to understand was that America could absorb Tarawa and Macon and Quaoline and Eniwetok and dozens of other blood-soaked beaches. Not because American lives were valued less, the opposite was true, but because the industrial and demographic capacity existed to replace losses while simultaneously growing stronger. Every month, more carriers entered service, more pilots completed training, more divisions shipped out from West Coast ports. Japan, by contrast, was being bled white. Every experienced pilot lost was irreplaceable. The training infrastructure couldn't produce equivalent veterans fast enough. Every ship sunk was gone forever. The shipyards were operating at maximum capacity just to replace losses, not to expand the fleet. Every island garrison that fought to annihilation was composed of men who could have defended the home islands later. The mathematics of attrition, which Japanese planners had understood abstractly before the war, had become a grinding reality that no amount of courage or fighting spirit could overcome. Private Yoshida Mitsuo, captured wounded on Quail in February 1944, spoke to an American interpreter with unexpected candor. Perhaps it was the morphine for his wounds, or perhaps the relief of survival after years of expecting death, but his words were recorded and filed in after-action reports. We were told you could not fight. We believed it because we wanted to believe it. When I joined the Army, they showed us films of American soldiers, fat and slow, caring more for their possessions than their duty. They said the Americans would run when faced with Japanese spirit. But you don't run. You come forward, always forward, and behind you are ships and planes without end. I think my country told us lies because the truth was too terrible to speak. The terrible truth was this: Pearl Harbor had not crippled America but catalyzed it. The attack had done what years of political debate could not unite a fractious democracy behind common purpose. The isolationist movement, so strong in 1940 that Roosevelt had to run for an unprecedented third term, partly on a promise to keep America out of war, evaporated overnight. The industrial capacity that had seemed directionless during the Depression years suddenly had purpose and direction. The immigrant nation, the melting pot that Japanese propagandists portrayed as a weakness, a country with no pure racial identity or unified culture, revealed that its diversity was a source of strength. The Brooklyn dock worker and the Kansas farmer, the Mexican-American from Los Angeles and the black soldier from Alabama, the Navajo code talker and the Japanese-American translator, whose loyalty to his adopted country exceeded anything the empire of his ancestors could claim, all of these found common cause in a way that a homogeneous, rigidly hierarchical society could not quite comprehend. By late 1943, the Pacific had become a highway for American power. The logistics network that supported combat operations was itself a kind of miracle. Liberty ships and tankers and transports moved in vast convoys, protected by destroyers and escort carriers, bringing everything an advancing military needed: fuel, ammunition, food, spare parts, mail from home, Coca-Cola, medical supplies, construction equipment, vehicles, more troops, more planes. Entire artificial harbors were created at captured atolls. Airfields went from jungle to operational in a matter of weeks. The Seabees, the Navy's construction battalions, became famous for their motto: the difficult we do immediately, the impossible takes a little longer. This logistical abundance had profound psychological effects. American troops knew that if they were wounded, they would receive the best medical care available: plasma, sulfa drugs, evacuation to hospital ships staffed with trained surgeons. They knew that mail would reach them, that supplies would arrive, that they would rotate home eventually. This certainty, this trust in the system supporting them, was itself a combat multiplier. It allowed them to focus on the mission without the desperate edge of men who knew they were expendable and forgotten. Japanese soldiers had no such assurance. Supply lines to forward garrisons grew more tenuous as American submarines devastated the merchant fleet. The Japanese military, trained in the tradition of living off the land, imposing on local populations, found itself increasingly isolated on islands that could not support the troops stationed there. Starvation became as deadly as combat. Disease, unchecked by adequate medicine, ravaged units. The reinforcements promised by headquarters never arrived, or arrived in such depleted numbers that they made no tactical difference. The phenomenon of stragglers, Japanese soldiers hiding in jungles, unaware or unwilling to believe the war had ended, sometimes for years after 1945, was partly a result of this abandonment. They had been told to fight to the death for the emperor, and so they waited for relief or death, whichever came first. The recurring symbol of American power, the chocolate bar and the C-ration and the cigarette, took on almost mystical significance in Japanese accounts of the period. It represented not just food, but a philosophy of war they had not anticipated, that soldiers could be kept comfortable, that their morale mattered, that industrial abundance could be devoted not just to weapons, but to welfare. The Japanese military tradition valorized suffering, saw deprivation as character building, treated comfort as weakness. American military logistics worked from the opposite assumption, that well-fed, well-supplied, relatively comfortable soldiers fought better and longer than starved, sick, desperate men. The Pacific War proved which philosophy was more effective. There is a photograph taken on Saipan in July 1944 that captures this transformation wordlessly. It shows two Japanese children, orphaned by the battle, sitting on a curb in what had been the town of Garapan. Between them is an American Marine, young himself, probably no more than 20. He is feeding them from his C-ration, breaking off pieces of cheese and crackers, letting them sip from his canteen. The children's faces show confusion. The Marine shows exhaustion, and something else, an unconscious kindness. The gesture so natural, he probably didn't realize anyone was photographing it. Behind them, blurred in the background, are the ruins of the town, smoke still rising from shattered buildings. That photograph circulated widely in the American press, and copies eventually reached Japan through neutral countries. The Japanese response to it was telling. Some called it propaganda staged. Others saw in it confirmation that the Americans lacked the hardness necessary for total war, that they were incapable of the ruthlessness required. They could not see, or refused to see, what the photograph actually showed, that a soldier could be both a fighter and a human being, that kindness and combat capability were not mutually exclusive, that a nation could wage war ferociously while maintaining the values for which it claimed to fight. The transformation of the Pacific between 1941 and 1943 was not just military, but ideological. The Japanese had gone to war believing in the superiority of their spirit, their willingness to sacrifice, their ancient warrior traditions. They encountered an enemy that matched their sacrifice without abandoning individuality, that fought as hard while preserving democratic values, that proved reluctantly, bloodily, but decisively that free societies possessed reserves of strength that authoritarian empires could not match. Admiral Yamamoto's prophecy had proven true. The sleeping giant had awakened, and his resolve was indeed terrible. But it was a particular kind of resolve, not the blind obedience of the fanatic, but the determined purpose of free men defending freedom. The Americans who island-hopped across The Pacific toward Japan were not conquerors seeking empire, but citizens in uniform who wanted the war over so they could go home. This distinction mattered. It meant they fought to end the conflict, not to perpetuate it. It meant they could be ruthlessly effective in battle while maintaining the capacity for that Marine's kindness toward children on a destroyed street. By the end of 1943, the question in the Pacific was no longer whether the Allies would win, but how long it would take and at what cost. The Japanese military, its back to the home islands, would fight with increasing desperation through 1944 and into 1945. The kamikaze attacks, the suicidal banzai charges, the refusal to surrender on Iwo Jima and Okinawa, these were the death. Spasms of an ideology that could not admit defeat without dishonor. But the outcome had been determined in those 2 years between Pearl Harbor and late 1943, determined by factors the Japanese planners had dismissed as irrelevant: industrial capacity, logistical sophistication, tactical flexibility, and the stubborn resilience of a democratic people who, once committed to a cause, saw it through to conclusion. The epilogue of this transformation would not be written until August 1945, when atomic fire over Hiroshima and Nagasaki brought the final, terrible punctuation to a conflict that might otherwise have ground on through invasion and annihilation. But the essential truth had revealed itself long before, that Pearl Harbor, conceived as a crippling blow, had instead been the catalyst for American power, that the attack meant to end the war before it began had instead ensured Japan's eventual destruction, that the soft, commercial, democratic society they had held in contempt possessed a strength born not from rigid obedience but from freedom itself. There is poetry in the reversal, though it is the dark poetry of war and suffering. The same harbor that burned on December 7th, 1941, became the staging point for the fleets that would carry the war to Japan's doorstep. The battleships raised from Pearl Harbor's mud, all but Arizona and Oklahoma, would return to service, their guns bombarding Japanese positions from the Aleutians to the Philippines. The sailors and Marines who survived that first terrible morning would become the sergeants and lieutenants who led the amphibious assaults across the Pacific. The nation that Japan had believed could not fight, would not fight, proved capable of waging the most extensive naval campaign in history across the largest ocean on Earth. In the end, the truth about freedom and abundance emerged through the funds, crucible of total war, that a society built on individual liberty, for all its apparent chaos and inefficiency, could mobilize resources and human will as effectively as any dictatorship, and could do so while maintaining the values that defined it. The chocolate bar shared with enemy children, the medical care given to wounded prisoners, the massive effort to feed not just troops, but liberated populations. These were not sidelines to the war effort, but expressions of it. They demonstrated that America fought not for empire or racial destiny, but for a different principle entirely, that human dignity, prosperity, and freedom were not weaknesses to be exploited, but strengths to be defended. Japan learned this truth the hardest way, possible through defeat, occupation, and the ashes of cities. But in that defeat lay the seeds of rebirth, of a Japan that would eventually embrace democratic governance and economic freedom, becoming in the post-war decades one of America's closest allies, and a testimony to the possibility of transformation. The Pacific that turned between 1941 and 1943 carried that future in its currents, though few could see it at the time. The men who fought that war, American and Japanese alike, are mostly gone now, their stories slipping into history. But the lesson remains, etched in the hulls of ships and the names of islands most people cannot find on a map that tyranny makes. The fatal mistake of confusing democracy's debates for weakness and its abundance for softness, not understanding that both are symptoms of strength, that a people who argue about everything when at peace will unite with devastating effect when threatened, that the nation comfortable enough to distribute chocolate to its soldiers and feed orphans in captured towns possesses reserves of power that military tradition and warrior spirit alone cannot match. Pearl Harbor was meant to cripple. Instead, it catalyzed. The Pacific turned not through any single battle, but through the accumulation of American will and resources, through the transformation of industrial capacity into military power, through the proof that free societies, when committed to common purpose, fight as effectively as any authoritarian regime, while maintaining the humanity that makes victory meaningful rather than merely tactical. That is the story told in the 2 years between December 1941 and late 1943, not just of battles won and territory retaken, but of a deeper truth demonstrated, that democracy is not weak, that freedom is not soft, that abundance is not decadence, but the visible sign of a system that works, that honors human dignity, that trusts its people. Japan bet its empire on the opposite belief and lost everything. America bet on the strength of its founding principles and won not just the war, but vindication of the idea that had created the nation itself, that ordinary people, given freedom and opportunity, can accomplish extraordinary things. The Pacific turned on that truth, carried on the hulls of Liberty's ships and the wings of corsairs, embodied in the determination of Marines waiting ashore and the abundance of supply depots that seemed bottomless. The chocolate bar, the C-ration, the cigarette small things, trivial in themselves, became the symbols of a larger reality, that America's strength came not from obedience, but from freedom, not from deprivation, but from prosperity, not from the willingness to die meaninglessly, but from the capacity to live abundantly and share that abundance even with enemies when the fighting stopped. That was the lesson Japan thought it was teaching on December 7th, 1941. That was the lesson it learned instead at terrible cost when the Pacific turned and freedom proved to be the strongest weapon of all.